There was this man named Daniel who lived a really long time ago in a place called Babylon. And he was someone really special because no matter what happened, he never stopped praying to God. Daniel wasn't originally from Babylon, though he was taken there when he was young, from his home in Jerusalem. And even though he was far from home and everything was different, he held on to his faith like it was the most precious thing in the world. Now, Daniel had this amazing gift. You see, he could understand dreams and visions, and God had given him incredible wisdom. So the king of Babylon, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar, noticed Daniel and thought, wow, this guy is really something special. Over the years, Daniel served under different kings, and he did it with such integrity and excellence that everyone could see there was something different about him. And it wasn't just that he was smart or capable. It was that he had this inner strength that came from his relationship with God. When a new king named Darius came to power, he saw how trustworthy Daniel was, and he made him one of the top 3 administrators in the entire kingdom. Can you imagine that? And Daniel didn't let it go to his head. He just kept doing what he always did, working hard and praying to God. But Daniel's success made some other officials really jealous, and they started watching him, looking for any mistake he might make so they could use it against him. But here's the thing. They couldn't find anything wrong with the way Daniel did his job because he was honest and faithful in everything. These jealous men would whisper to each other, saying, how can we bring Daniel down? And finally, one of them had an idea, and he said, the only way we're going to find anything against Daniel is if it has something to do with his religion, because that's the one thing he'll never compromise on. So they came up with this sneaky plan, and they went to King Darius with big smiles on their faces, pretending to have the king's best interests at heart when really they were plotting something terrible. The jealous officials gathered around King Darius, and they said, "O king, live forever." And they were putting on this whole show, acting like they were so concerned and loyal, when really their hearts were full of envy and scheming. They told the king, "We think it would be a great idea if you made a new law, and the law should say that for the next 30 days, everyone in the kingdom can only pray to you, O king, and if anyone prays to any god or any person except you, they should be thrown into the den of lions." Now, King Darius, he liked the sound of this because it made him feel important and powerful, and he didn't realize that this whole thing was a trap set up to catch Daniel. So he agreed to it, and he signed the law into effect. Once a law was signed by the king in those days, it became part of something called the Law of the Medes and Persians. And this was really serious because it meant that once a law was made, not even the king himself could change it or take it back. The jealous officials were so excited when the king signed that law because they knew exactly what Daniel would do, and they could barely hide their smirks as they left the king's presence, thinking they had finally found a way to get rid of Daniel once and for all. Daniel heard about the new law. Of course, everyone in the kingdom heard about it, but when Daniel heard it, he didn't panic, and he didn't get angry, and he definitely didn't think, well, I guess I better stop praying for 30 days to save my own skin. Instead, Daniel went home to his upstairs room, just like he always did. And you know what? He had windows that opened toward Jerusalem, toward his beloved homeland. And he got down on his knees right there by those windows 3 times a day, just like he had always done. Daniel prayed to God and gave thanks, and he didn't try to hide it because his faith wasn't something he was ashamed of or something he thought he should keep secret when things got difficult. His faith was who he was, and he trusted God completely, no matter what might happen to him. The officials who had set this trap, they were watching and waiting, and when they saw Daniel praying, they were like, "Yes, we've got him now," and they practically ran back to the king to tell him what they had seen. They said to King Darius, Didn't you sign a law that says anyone who prays to any god or person except you for the next 30 days should be thrown into the lion's den?" And the king said, "Yes, that's right. I signed that law, and it can't be changed." Then they dropped the bomb and said, "Well, Daniel, that man from Judah, who is one of your top administrators, he's not paying any attention to you, O king, or to the law you signed, because he still prays 3 times a day to his God." When King Darius heard this, his heart just sank, and he felt sick to his stomach because he realized he had been tricked, and now his friend Daniel, the man he trusted and respected more than almost anyone, was going to pay the price for the king's foolishness. The king was so distressed, and he immediately started trying to think of ways he could save Daniel, and he spent the whole rest of that day working on it, trying to find some loophole in the law or some way around it, but there wasn't one. Those jealous officials, they could see what the king was doing, and they came back to him, and they said, "O king, remember that, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or law that you sign can be changed." And they said it in this way that was almost mocking, like they knew they had won. King Darius felt trapped and powerless, even though he was the king of this huge empire, and he couldn't save the one man who deserved to be saved. And the weight of that realization was crushing him, and you could see it in his eyes. As the sun started to set, the king knew he had run out of time, and he had to give the order. And it was one of the hardest things he had ever done, because he genuinely cared about Daniel, and he knew this was wrong, but the law was the law. So Daniel was arrested, and they brought him before the king. And Darius looked at Daniel with such sadness in his eyes, and he said to him, "May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you." And you could hear the hope and desperation in the king's voice. Daniel looked back at the king with such peace on his face, and there was no anger there, and no fear really, just this calm assurance that God was in control, and that whatever happened, Daniel was going to be okay, because he knew whom he trusted. They took Daniel to the lion's den, and this wasn't just some cage. This was a deep pit where they kept these fierce, hungry lions. And these were animals that could tear a person apart in seconds, and everyone knew that being thrown into the lion's den was basically a death sentence. The soldiers lowered Daniel down into that dark pit, and you could hear the lions growling and moving around down there in the shadows. And then they rolled a huge stone over the opening to seal it shut, so there was no way out. King Darius himself sealed the stone with his own royal signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed, and no one could sneak in and rescue Daniel, and the king's hands were shaking as he did it. Then the king went back to his palace, but he couldn't eat anything, and he couldn't enjoy any entertainment. And he sent away all the musicians and performers who usually helped him relax, and he just sat there in his chambers, consumed with worry. All night long, King Darius couldn't sleep. He just kept thinking about Daniel down in that pit with those lions, and he kept hoping against hope that somehow Daniel's God would save him. But he also knew that no one had ever survived the lion's den before. Down in the lion's den, it was dark, and it smelled like wild animals, and you could hear the sounds of the lions breathing and moving, and their claws scraping against the stone floor of the pit. Daniel stood there in the darkness, and he wasn't alone with just the lions, because God was there with him too. And Daniel could feel that presence, that same presence he had felt every time he prayed, and it gave him a courage that didn't make any human sense. The lions, they started moving toward Daniel, and you would think this would be the end, right? Because these were fierce predators who hadn't been fed. And here was a person who should have looked like dinner to them, but something amazing happened. God sent his angel down into that pit, and the angel shut the mouths of those lions. And it wasn't that the lions weren't there anymore, or that they had suddenly become tame. It was that God was protecting Daniel in a supernatural way that was beyond explanation. The lions would get close to Daniel, and then it was like they hit an invisible wall, and they would stop and lay down. And throughout that whole long night, not one of those lions touched Daniel, not even a little bit. Daniel spent the night praying and worshiping God right there in the lion's den, and he was thanking God for his faithfulness and for his protection. And Daniel knew that whether God chose to save him or not, God was still good and still worthy of worship. You know, Daniel wasn't praying for God to get him out of this situation. He had already accepted whatever was going to happen instead. He was just being with God in the middle of the trial, and there's something really powerful about that kind of faith. The hours passed slowly, and Daniel could hear the sounds of the city above him, getting quiet as everyone went to sleep. But he knew the king wasn't sleeping, and somehow in his spirit, Daniel knew that this whole situation was going to end up bringing glory to God. Up in the palace, King Darius was pacing back and forth, and every minute felt like an hour. And he kept replaying everything in his mind and wishing he had been wiser and wishing he hadn't let himself be manipulated by those jealous officials. The king thought about all the times Daniel had served him faithfully and all the wise counsel Daniel had given him and how Daniel had never asked for anything in return. And now the king couldn't do the one thing that mattered, which was save his friend's life. As the night dragged on, the king's servants were worried about him because they had never seen him like this, so distressed and so unable to be comforted. And they whispered among themselves about how much the king must care about Daniel. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the first light of dawn started to appear on the horizon. And the king jumped up immediately and called for his servants to get ready because he had to go to the lion's den right away to see what had happened. King Darius rushed to the lion's den as fast as he could, and his heart was pounding, and he was almost afraid to look. But he had to know what had happened to Daniel and whether there was any chance at all that he had survived. When the king got to the lion's den, he called out in an anguished voice, and he said, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" And you could hear the desperation and the fear in his voice. There was a moment of silence that must have felt like forever to the king. And then, from down in the pit, came Daniel's voice, and he said, "O king, live forever." And Daniel sounded completely fine, not weak or injured or scared, just calm and peaceful. Daniel continued talking, and he said, "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions, and they haven't hurt me at all, because I was found innocent in God's sight. And I haven't done anything wrong against you either, O king." When King Darius heard Daniel's voice coming from that pit alive and well, he felt such overwhelming relief and joy that he could hardly contain it. And he immediately ordered his servants to pull Daniel up out of the lion's den right away. They rolled away the stone and lowered ropes down into the pit. And when they pulled Daniel up, everyone gathered around to look at him, and they examined him carefully. And you know what? They couldn't find a single scratch or injury on him, nothing at all. The Bible says that Daniel was lifted out of the den, and no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And that trust had been rewarded in the most miraculous way possible, and everyone who saw it was absolutely amazed. Daniel stood there in the morning light, and he looked tired maybe, but he was smiling, and there was such peace radiating from him, and you could tell that his faith had been strengthened even more by this experience, if that was even possible. The king looked at Daniel with such admiration and relief, and he probably wanted to hug him, but instead he did something even more important. he immediately gave orders about those men who had falsely accused Daniel. King Darius commanded that they bring those jealous officials who had set Daniel up, and along with their wives and children. They were all thrown into the lion's den, and this was the king's justice for the evil they had done. The Bible tells us that before these accusers even reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones, and this proved that it wasn't that the lions weren't hungry or that they had somehow become gentle creatures. No, it was specifically God's protection that had saved Daniel. This was actually the custom in those ancient times when someone was found guilty of falsely accusing another person. They would receive the same punishment that they had tried to bring on the innocent person, and in this case, that meant the lion's den. After this, King Darius was changed by what he had witnessed, and he sat down and wrote a decree that would go out to all the people in his kingdom, to every nation and language group. And it was going to be a message about Daniel's God. King Darius stood there looking at the decree he was about to send out, and his hands held the scroll carefully because he knew this was one of the most important things he would ever write as king. The decree started with the words that were traditional for royal announcements, and it said, "To all peoples, nations, and those who speak every language throughout the whole world, may you prosper greatly." And this was his way of addressing everyone in his kingdom. Then the king wrote something that would have been absolutely shocking to hear from a pagan king who ruled over a kingdom full of idol worship. And he wrote, "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel." The king continued writing, and he said, "For God is the living God, and he endures forever, and his kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end." And you can just feel the conviction in these words, like the king had really been impacted by what he witnessed. Darius went on to describe God's character, and he wrote that God rescues, and he saves, and he performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, and he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions, and every word was true. This decree was copied many times by the royal scribes, and it was sent out on horseback to every corner of the kingdom. And when people read it, they were amazed because here was their king, a man who had been raised to worship many different gods, declaring that Daniel's God was the true God. In the palace, Daniel had been restored to his position of honor, and actually, the king trusted him even more than before, if that was possible, because Daniel had proven that his integrity and his faith were unshakable no matter what. Daniel continued to serve in the kingdom with wisdom and excellence, and he prospered during the reign of Darius and also during the reign of Cyrus the Persian, who came after him, and God continued to use Daniel to accomplish important things. You know what's really beautiful about this story is that Daniel never compromised his faith, even when it meant facing death. And because of that faithfulness, God not only protected him, but used the whole situation to make his name known to an entire kingdom. The other officials in the kingdom, they learned a hard lesson about trying to destroy someone who was innocent and who was protected by God. And from that point on, nobody dared to scheme against Daniel because they had seen what happened. Daniel's testimony spread far and wide, and people would talk about the man who survived the lion's den, and they would marvel at the power of his God. And this was exactly what God wanted, because through Daniel's faithfulness, many people came to know about the one true God. In his quiet times, Daniel would kneel by his window, just like always, praying toward Jerusalem and thanking God for his faithfulness and for using him as a witness and for protecting him in such an amazing way. The story of Daniel in the lion's den became one that parents would tell their children, and it would be told for generations and generations as an example of what it looks like to have faith that doesn't waver even when everything is on the line. You know, when you really think about Daniel's story, there's so much we can learn from it about what it means to have faith. That doesn't depend on our circumstances, but remains steady no matter what comes our way. Daniel had every reason to be afraid when he heard about the king's decree. He knew exactly what it meant. And he knew that if he continued praying, he would be thrown to the lions. But his fear of God was greater than his fear of lions or death. What's really striking is that Daniel didn't make a big public show of his faithfulness. He didn't stand in the street corner, praying loudly so everyone could see how dedicated he was. Instead, he just went home and did what he had always done, quietly, faithfully, consistently. There's something powerful about consistency in faith, isn't there? Because it's easy to pray when things are going well, and it's easy to trust God when life is comfortable. But can we keep praying when it costs us something? That's the real test. Daniel's faith wasn't based on whether God would save him from the lions. It was based on who God was, regardless of the outcome. And that's a mature faith that says, I'm going to serve God, whether he rescues me or not, because he's worthy of my devotion. Think about how Daniel's faithfulness impacted everyone around him. The king was moved to write a decree about God. The other officials learned they couldn't shake a righteous person, and a whole kingdom heard about the power of the living God. Sometimes we wonder if our faith really matters, if anyone is watching, or if it makes a difference. But Daniel's story shows us that when we live with integrity and unwavering faith, people notice, and God uses it in ways we might never imagine. Daniel also teaches us about the importance of prayer as a foundation of life. He didn't just pray when he was in trouble, or when he needed something. He prayed 3 times a day consistently, and that regular communication with God was what kept him strong. You know, it's interesting that Daniel prayed with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He could have closed the windows and prayed in secret, and technically, that would have kept him safe from the law. But Daniel understood that his faith wasn't something to hide. The courage Daniel showed wasn't reckless or foolish. It was the courage that comes from knowing God intimately, from years of walking with him, and trusting him, and seeing his faithfulness over and over again in life. When we face our own lions' dens, whatever they might be, we can remember Daniel and know that the same God who shut the mouths of those lions is with us, and he's still in the business of protecting and providing for his people. Daniel's story also reminds us that God's ways of saving us might not always look the way we expect. God didn't prevent Daniel from being thrown into the lion's den, but he was with Daniel in the den, and that made all the difference. Sometimes we pray for God to take away our difficulties, but maybe what we really need is to experience God's presence in the middle of them, and to have our faith refined and strengthened through the trial, just like Daniel's was. The peace that Daniel had in that lion's den, the ability to sleep peacefully, surrounded by predators, that's the kind of peace that passes understanding. And it comes from a deep trust in God's character and his promises. As the years went by and Daniel grew older, his story continued to inspire people, and it became one of those testimonies that never gets old because it speaks to something deep in the human heart about courage and faith and trusting God. Daniel lived a long life, and he served faithfully under multiple kings and empires, and through all the changes and challenges. He remained that same person of integrity and devotion that he had always been. Young people in Babylon would hear about Daniel, and they would be encouraged to stand firm in their own faith, even when it was hard, and even when everyone around them was doing something different, because they had seen that God honors those who honor him. The story of the lion's den became a symbol of God's deliverance, and throughout history, whenever people faced persecution or danger for their faith, They would remember Daniel and take courage, knowing that God is able to save. But you know, the legacy of Daniel isn't just about one miraculous night in a lion's den. It's about a lifetime of faithfulness, about choosing to do what's right every single day, even when no one is watching, and even when it would be easier to compromise. Daniel showed us that you don't have to be perfect to be faithful, and you don't have to have a position of power to make a difference. You just have to be willing to trust God and to let Him work through your obedience. The prayer life that Daniel maintained throughout his life, that was the secret to his strength and his wisdom and his ability to stand firm when others would have fallen. And that's something any of us can do. We can all choose to make prayer a priority. Think about the ripple effects of Daniel's faithfulness. One man's decision to keep praying led to an entire kingdom hearing about the true God, led to a king writing a decree about God's power, led to generations of people being inspired to stand firm in their own faith. Daniel's story reminds us that our lives are not just about us. They're about being witnesses to the world around us, about showing people what it looks like to trust God completely and to live with integrity and to maintain hope even in dark times. As we end this story tonight, think about your own life and the challenges you might be facing. Maybe you have your own lion's den, something that seems scary or overwhelming or impossible to face. But remember, you serve the same God that Daniel served. God hasn't changed. He's still the God who shuts the mouths of lions and who protects His people and who is with us in every trial and every difficulty. And just like He was faithful to Daniel, He will be faithful to you. Maybe you're at a crossroads where you have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right, between going along with the crowd and standing firm in your convictions. And if that's you, then remember Daniel and ask God for the courage to choose faithfully. The beautiful thing about faith is that it grows stronger each time we exercise it. Each time we choose to trust God. Even when it's hard, we're building that muscle of faith. And the next time, it will be a little easier to trust Him. Daniel's legacy lives on not just in the Bible, but in every person who reads his story and decides to live with that same kind of unwavering faith and commitment to God, and in every person who chooses prayer over popularity and integrity over convenience. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you're loved by the same God who loved Daniel and protected him. Remember that no lion's den in your life is too big for God to handle, and remember that faithfulness matters more than we could ever imagine. Let Daniel's story encourage you to pray boldly, to live faithfully, and to trust completely in the God who is always with us, who never leaves us, and who is able to do immeasurably more than we could ask or imagine, according to His power at work within us. And just like King Darius discovered, may we all come to know more deeply that God is the living God who endures forever, whose kingdom will not be destroyed, whose dominion will never end, who rescues and saves and performs signs and wonders. Rest well tonight, knowing that the same God who was with Daniel in the lion's den is with you wherever you are and whatever you're facing. And may your faith grow stronger as you remember His faithfulness. Amen.